Sir Matt Busby is one of the most respected and revered managers in the history of the game in Great Britain, and I'm delighted that I'm going to get the chance to talk to a man who's written all about Sir Matt. It's a new book out, and my old journalistic friend Patrick Barclay has brought out this book, Sir Matt Busby, The Definitive Biography. And if you are a fan of Manchester United and the history, then this man is inextricably linked to it. Patrick, the first thing I've got to ask you is what prompted you to write the definitive biography when so many others have gone before?
Well, the point is that I wrote a few years ago, I wrote a book about Sir Alex Ferguson, and it always occurred to me that that at least two generations of people need to be reminded that one of Sir Alex Ferguson's greatest achievements was to replicate what Sir Matt Busby had done. And I don't think Alex Ferguson would consider that demeaning or in any way diminishing his achievement. I mean, how could you chip away at that block of his achievements? But I think he would probably concede that he continued the traditions of Matt Busby, he continued the methods of Matt Busby, and he continued the philosophy of Matt Busby in Manchester United. And I think that's one of I mean, people talk about the trophies won under Ferguson. I think maintaining the philosophy that Busby built was, to me, one of his most important achievements.
Yeah, and reading the book early on, he had a good career as a footballer.
Yeah.
Was his upbringing in Bells Hill and his development down south at the likes of Manchester City and Liverpool, was that what created almost this, ethos in his mind about the way football should be played?
Well, right from, if we go right back to, but you mentioned Bells Hill. It was part of Bells Hill was there were many mining villages. His was Orbiston, unfortunately no longer there. The people of Bells Hill are still undecided about where the village was, but that's another story. But that was fundamental. I mean, it's first chronologically, but it's also first, I think, in the making of the man, because if you look at great football managers, you look at, and plenty of them are Scots, particularly Shankly, Bob Paisley, Herbert Chapman, the first great manager down at Arsenal. They all come from mining communities. And mining communities taught interdependence, because interdependence could be quite literally a matter of death, a life and death. And so I think that was the beginning. I know it's been said before, but mining and old industrial communities forged that sense of having to look out for one another. That is, I think, still the basis of a healthy football club. So that was the first thing. But then when he went down to Manchester City at the age of, he was under 19, and for a boy that never been out of Scotland before, in fact, as far as I know, he'd never been out of that Bells Hill belt, Lanarkshire, to go, all the way to Manchester for a trial and then sign for City, and then to find that the senior players turning their backs on him, because it wasn't. And he resolved then that if he ever got charge of a football club, it would be a family, and the young players would be looked after. So in a sense, both his career as a player, which eventually became successful, but he went through terrible times when he was a young player, being shunned by many of the older players who were jealous probably of their own positions. It was so bad that he went through a spell of what I think would now be diagnosed as depression.
Yeah, and the one thing that's, runs right through the book is you paint a lovely picture of the person at that time, his history, the social circumstances, and of course religion, which wasn't as, shall I say, it didn't have as big an edge in England as it does in Scotland.
No, not at all. In Scotland, I mean, when he was a little boy, I mean, there were riots in Motherwell. I mean, serious riots, the kind of thing, that later, became associated with some cities in Northern Ireland. But There were big sectarian riots in Motherwell. And of course, Roman Catholics at that time were disadvantaged. The government was, the Westminster government was only in the process of giving everybody, rights to educate, free education and so on. So, yeah, it was difficult. And in fact, Matt had a friend. Matt was brought up in a devout Catholic family, unfortunately without a father from the age of 5 because of the First World War. But his mother very much believed in integration, and she gave him he had a great education. His mother's a huge figure in the book. But he did have a friend who was called Frank Rogers, and Frank was a bit of a hard man, around Orbiston and Bells Hill. And he was once said to have found a horse outside his house, and he decked it with one punch. So Matt would have got into a few fights with Frank Rogers, and Frank's family were maybe a little bit more hardline, but it was all part of growing up.
Yeah, I could dissect every part of the book chronologically. I mean, some of it is well documented. One of the things that I think was a joy is here is a man who didn't believe he could buy success. So he started to build United, even with a dilapidated stadium.
Yes.
He wanted to build it with youth in mind.
Yeah, he took over at United immediately after the war. The stadium had been bombed. It wasn't the only stadium in Britain that had taken a bit of damage, but it was the only one that was totally unusable and would remain unusable for the foreseeable future. So they had no home. They had no money. They did have an idea of a youth policy, and they'd already recruited some players who, it turned out, were very successful for Matt in the first instance. But yeah, he had demanded, even though it was his first managerial job at Manchester United, not as big a club as he made it, but it was still a big club, big-ish club. He demanded a 5-year contract and got it. So, and that was on the basis that he was going to build. He wasn't going to buy. There wasn't any money anyway, frankly. So he was going to build and improve young players. And he gradually, the idea of the club at that time was that they wanted Manchester boys in the Manchester team, sort of, I suppose, Athletic Bilbao would be the only place where you could the Basques, only place you could really compare it with now. But that was the aspiration. But Matt saw that he was going to have to cast his net a little further afield and set up a scouting system that would reach to, well, for example, the northeast the northeast of England for Bobby Charlton in the mining country of Ashington, up there, and the Midlands of England, where he picked up the great Duncan Edwards.
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned his name, because when I look at the teams that he built, when I started reading your section on Munich, it's one of the most emotional, because you feel yourself welling up at, the pain of how his whole life and everything shatters, and of course the likes of Duncan Edwards, a special player
who died, and when he died after 14 days of fighting for his life, even the nurses, the German nurses, it was a hospital in Munich, and where the crash took place, they cried, and of course Matt was still completely unaware, almost completely unaware. He knew something bad had happened, but everybody was including his wife Jean, was under instructions not to talk about it. But yes, the Munich section was the one, in writing the book, the one I was most frightened of, the one I knew I had to do something with. And the way I did it was to introduce people. Everybody knows that players died, and not only players, journalists and others. And Matt could have died, was to introduce you to those people while they were still alive. And so, it's very kind of you to say that you were moved by it, and I certainly was, still when I think about it now. I mean, I was 11 when that happened, but in 1958, but writing it, especially with the help of Harry Gregg, the goalkeeper who was the hero of Munich, that really made it feel raw and real. But Harry's still with us in his mid-80s, and still as strident and impossible to shut up as ever. I'm glad to say.
Yeah, well, and I'm glad he's still here. The one
Yeah.
thing I would say to you, and again, we could easily dedicate, over an hour on this book. I don't want to preempt it for anyone who's going to get the joy of reading it. 10 years on, United win the cup, and then from there, I think the legacy that he leaves United with. How do you think? Where does he stand in the pantheon of great managers for you?
Well, pretty close to number one. A lot of people, and you're probably thinking it, Busby or Ferguson. I don't know. Busby's son said, my dad was the foundation, Sir Alex was the resurrection, which is a good way of putting it. And I'm going to use that evasion. But no, I would say that the founder is the greater of the two, always. I would put Shankly above Paisley, for example, in Liverpool terms, because without Shankly there wouldn't have been Paisley, and I can promise you that without Busby, Sir Alex Ferguson wouldn't have left Aberdeen for Manchester United.
You mentioned Munich. How difficult do you think it was for Sir Matt to actually get to a point where he wanted to continue again, because his dreams must have been completely shattered?
It was very difficult because once Duncan Edwards had died and he started asking questions and overhearing things, and he went to Jean, his wife, and said, come on, you've got to tell me the truth. And this time she could no longer pat him on the head and say, listen, Matt, we'll all in good time. She knew she had to tell him the truth. He went through a huge crisis there. Guilt, the usual thing, I suppose, is why did they die and I live? But also, if I hadn't been so keen on European football, we wouldn't be on this plane. This whole thing wouldn't have happened. And he went through a real crisis. And I came across an interview with one of your predecessors as a distinguished Scottish broadcaster, Arthur Montfort. And he told Arthur Montfort in this, hardly remembered interview that he didn't care if he lived or died. Now, for such a devout man to say something like that, it obviously is that was a crisis that would stay with him forever. But Jean, his wife, was fundamental, really, in talking him round. He may have come round to wanting to go back to management anyway, but she said that the best tribute he could pay to the boys that he'd lost, and it was almost like losing sons. That particular team, which he rated his best, the Duncan Edwards, Eddie Coleman lot. And she said, well, the best way to pay tribute is to rebuild. It was a sort of... that cathartic effect, I suppose catharsis was a fashionable word in those days, but Matt took the message from Jean. And from then on, he was determined. He came back for the FA Cup final, which United lost, but by then he took it step by step. And he cried. He cried when the first time he went back to Old Trafford.
Yeah, and picking up on, the length of time that it was going to take him, he mentioned 5 years, possibly 10 years as a project, especially with Europe in mind. We talk down through the years about partnerships. You think of Clough and Taylor, you think of Steen and Fallon, you even think of maybe, Bob Paisley and Joe Fagan, although there was more in the Anfield boot room in the background that helped it. How important do you think, Sir Matt Busby and Jimmy Murphy was as the partnership?
Well, the players, the old players, the Bobby Charltons, maybe not Dennis. I don't think Dennis acknowledges ever been taught football. I think no, that's probably not fair. But Dennis and Paddy Crerand, for example, they all say that Jimmy Murphy was a great coach. They learned so much from him. The young players as well, the Nobby Styleses who came through the ranks. I mean, obviously, the Scots were largely bought, but there were Scots who grew up at the club as well. They all talked about about Murphy. There was one player, John Doherty, who was a Mancunian, and he talked about Murphy having sort of two sides to him. And he said one day he was brought back in the afternoon for training. He was dressed. He'd been for his lunch, and he was told to strip off again and given a ball on the centre circle and told to kick it right out to the touchline. So he did. And Jimmy Murphy said, right, now go and get it. And he went and got it, dribbled it back to the centre spot, put it there, and he says, what do I do next? He says, kick it back out there. Kicked it out there. And he never told him why. He made him do it 6 times. Never told him why. But later he got one of the other players to ask him, and he said he played one of those Hollywood balls when he should have played a short pass. He won't do it again.
Yeah. But you mentioned the qualities of Murphy, but you also rated Sir Matt highly as a coach as well, because you only have to look back at his intrigue with Hungary and what they did to England, and of course at the World Cup as well.
The Hungarian team that famous for the 2 victories over England at Wembley and also in Budapest in 53 and 54, that was his dream team. And they didn't play in a way that we in an orthodox way, although the Scottish and English styles, obviously, but and everybody watching will know that the Scottish and English styles at the beginning of football did differ, and in Scotland's favour by a long way. But there were things that those Hungarians played which you just didn't see. Players popping up in positions, centre forwards playing on, false nines. They were doing false nines essentially in advance. So, he loved that team, and he did incorporate as many elements. If you watch little clips, you can occasionally find little clips of the 58 side, his favourite side, the side that died at Munich, almost completely wiped out at Munich. You can see a lot in the 1 and 2 touch that actually refers to the best football you see even now. Yeah. It's classical football, but even 10 years before then, 1948 Cup final, you talked about tactics rather than method and style. Stanley Matthews, it was a great final, 1948 FA Cup final, Manchester United 4, Blackpool 2, a great match, hailed on all sides. And afterwards, Stanley Matthews says that Matt Busby's tactics won it. The way he, clamped down on our wing halves, who are our creative players, and all that, that Busby's tactical adjustments had won the game. So he became less tactical in that period you were talking about between Munich, the decade between Munich and the winning of the Champions League, European Cup, call it what you will. He became more reliant on star players, Dennis Law being, an obvious example, plus a homebred lad called George Best, who was quite useful as well. Yeah,
and 2 quick points to finish on it. Players. Yeah. You mentioned, his experience. He's a canny manager. Yeah. If he had that, if he embraced socialism, then he sure hid it when he made, he got his wages and he had to keep some players in check.
By the way,
but as time goes on, he had to keep not only players in check with wage demands, but he had to keep some players in check with their social life. George is the classic example.
George was the classic example. You're talking about the early days when the maximum wage, and I said his wage, Matt's own wages were, although he was professed, as you say, professed socialist, his wages were taking the fast lift while they took the slow escalator. But he didn't, when he died at the age of 84, he left £200,000, which would have just about bought a modest house, at that time in 1993. He gave away a lot of the money because he ensured the education of his seven granddaughters. Yeah. He used to talk very proudly about that. 7 grandchildren, all of them girls.
Do you think Best was probably the one player? You know, Billy Connolly came out with a great line that sometimes you have to accommodate genius because genius won't accommodate you.
Yes.
Did that sum up Best and
Yes,
Sir
it
Matt?
did, and it definitely summed up Matt's attitude. I wonder now if it would have. One of the people I spoke to was Ian Ewer, who's a hero of mine because I'm a Dundee supporter, and he helped to win us the title in 1961 too. And Ian's still going strong and still has very interesting views on that era. As you know, he was signed from Arsenal for United by Matt, even though Matt had stepped down, and he was absolutely scathing about how Matt had let that team go on too long. And he said he should have not only sold the stars who'd won, he said he should even have sold George, even though he's only 24, 25 and had won the European Footballer of the Year a couple of years earlier. He was such a bad influence. Now, you know, he was ill, George.
Yeah.
It wasn't willful misbehaviour, I don't think. But he was a disruptive influence. And you wonder if Alex Ferguson would not have grasped that nettle. I think he would, you know, and I think we might have found even the great George Best taking the David Beckham route out of Old Trafford.
Yeah, and the last point, I think it would be remiss of me not to talk about it. I mean, fate played a hand in United not becoming the first club to win the European Cup, but when they eventually...
Well, yeah, and Celtic.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it was Celtic the year before. I think actually Sir Matt handed over the BBC Team of the Year award to Jock Stein.
That's right.
But 1968, it was a special time. It was the first English club to win that trophy, and everybody was embracing it by that time as well. Can you sum up the team that he built then? You know, 58 was his great loss, but 68 was a special side.
Well, 68 was a special side because of the three great players. I mean, I suppose if you include Paddy Crerand, you know, the three great and one not far off player. And a certain guy, a Scottish influence there, certainly with Dennis, although he didn't play in the final. That was a glamorous team. That made, I think, you know, if the Busby Babes, the team that died at Munich, made United popular, I think the glamour of that alluded to the 60s and increasing popularisation of football, and probably got us to the stage now where Manchester United is synonymous with glamour and one of the world's great clubs. I really do think that team probably put the lid on it, as far as that was concerned. Yeah.
And I hate to finish with what you would call your classic pub question, but I think it's relevant to Sir Matt in all his time at Manchester United. He would never have probably tried to categorise the players in a 5-4-3-2-1. But where do you think he would have his top 5 of United players that he had under his reign?
When he retired for the first time in 1969, he was pressed to name a team, and he did. So I've got a pretty good idea. Duncan Edwards would have been the top 5.
Yeah.
Duncan Edwards, George Best. No goalkeeper. There always had problems with the goalkeepers. There was a winger in the 1948 team called Charlie Mitten who he bombed out of the club.
Yes, absolutely.
Because he went to Colombia for the money. And he still named Mitten in his top team. And there was another great Scottish winger, Jimmy Delaney. How many have I got? I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, and Eddie Coleman, the midfield player of the Busby Babes. But then,
so he leaves out Law and Charlton?
I've left out Law and Charlton. So no, Law would have to go in. So we'd have to drop maybe Delaney to get Dennis Law in, because I mean, he loved Dennis Law. Dennis played through pain for him. And you know, the strange thing that it's actually obviously it's in the book, but Dennis told me that he was played out of position in his whole career. He wasn't a striker. He didn't think he was a striker. He was a box-to-box midfield player like Brian Robson, say, or something like that. But Matt wanted him to play as a striker, so he played as a striker, but used to come deep and pick the ball up as well. But yeah, Dennis, without shadow of doubt, Dennis would have been in, and George would have been in for all, his personal flaws. But I mean, really, you could pick another five-a-side team, and what a five-a-side game you'd have.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, listen, I'm sure for everyone who reads books, still into the art of reading books, or even nowadays, you can get it online as well.
Ebook,
Yeah, I think it's a fantastic read. I've thoroughly enjoyed it. There are moments in it which are truly emotional, which is to your great credit, Patrick.
Thank you.
If anyone wants to, read up on a fantastic manager and some of the great teams that he built, Sir Matt Busby, the definitive biography by Patrick Barclay. I want to thank you, Patrick, for joining us on the programme. And even if you're not a United fan, if you're a man or a woman who loves football, go and get the book from Patrick Barclay and myself, Peter Martin. Thanks for watching.